Picture Paris in the 1920s. Jazz in the cafes, lights glowing on the boulevards, and a city trying to forget the Great War. But in the back rooms, the diaries and the police files, another story appears: men and women living in same-sex relationships that most history books skip. Writers in Montparnasse left letters filled with affection to same-sex partners. Artists painted bodies that challenged the norms. Police reports quietly listed moral offenses in cabarets where men danced with men and women with women. Foreign visitors wrote about a freedom in Paris that shocked them, but also drew them in. So how should we read these traces? Was Paris a haven for same-sex love, or just a city where secrets were easier to hide? The evidence leaves us guessing. What do you think? Was Paris in the 1920s truly more open or simply more discreet? Share in the comments and let me know the time you're watching. If you enjoy history, told with questions, not certainties, subscribing is always your choice. They tell you Paris in the 1920s is a city of light, but you step into Montmartre and realize it's more a city of smoke. Cigarette haze curls through narrow cabaret doors. Absinthe swirls in glasses, and jazz slaps its syncopated rhythm against the wooden tables. You feel the bass in your chest, like a second heartbeat, and right away, you know you've wandered into a place where masks are thin, where whispers carry more truth than shouts, and where people live lives they can't declare in daylight. Isn't it strange how the brightest city in Europe hides its boldest truths in the darkest corners? You slide into the district by following the sound of a trumpet, one that seems to be arguing with itself, climbing high and then stumbling low, like it can't decide whether to laugh or cry. Inside, le boeuf sur le toit. The cabaret is a mess of feather sequins and wide eyes pretending to look innocent. The famous composer, Jean Cocteau, is rumored to be somewhere near the piano, scribbling lines of surreal poetry between cigarette drags. He won't shout his love out loud in the streets. It's 1920s Paris after all, and law still glances suspiciously at anything too open. But here inside this smoke-lit cave, he can drop hints as bold as the rhythm. You watch him, and you think, isn't it ironic that art has always been the safest place to tell the truth? The waiters brush past with trays of Pernod, muttering in accents so thick you have to guess half the words. A couple of men in slick hair and pressed suits laugh a little too close to one another, one hand brushing the other's sleeve just long enough for you to notice. Nobody gasps, nobody points. They just turn back to their drinks, because here in Montmartre, everyone's got their own little theater to manage, and you sitting at a sticky table in the corner realize you're in the middle of a neighborhood that's playing host to one of history's quiet revolutions. Think about it, the Great War had ended just a few years earlier, and people were desperate to feel alive again. Soldiers had seen enough trenches and mud to last 10 lifetimes, so when peace finally came, they poured into cities, searching for something reckless, something that defied all the rules they had just watched crumble in gunfire. Montmartre became that place. Freedom was in the air, though it didn't come with legal protections or polite acceptance. It came instead in sly glances, double meanings, and the hum of jazz that drowned out anyone's protest. You lean back against the wall, plastered with posters, half peeling, half shouting names you almost recognize. Josephine Baker isn't performing tonight, but her shadow lingers in every dancer who sways across the stage. Baker, the American who made Paris her home, danced in costumes made of bananas and laughter shocking the bourgeois, while slipping winks at those who understood her playful rebellion. She wasn't only entertaining, she was challenging the room to see the human body and maybe love itself in new ways. Can you imagine being in that crowd, not just clapping for her, but feeling like she was speaking to you in a secret language? Your chair creaks as you shift, and suddenly you catch the conversation at the next table. Two artists are arguing about Picasso's latest sketches, one insisting that his fractured faces reflect the fractured lives they all lead, the other rolling his eyes and saying, "It's just about money." You smile because isn't that the eternal argument, art as revelation or art as hustle? But underneath their debate, you hear something else, a subtle tug. The way one man tilts his head when the other laughs, the way their voices soften when the waiter drifts too close. In Montmartre, love is a game of gestures, a coded language you're just beginning to learn. The music grows louder, the clarinet squealing like it's trying to escape the ceiling beams, and you feel a tap on your shoulder. It's a young man with a sketch pad offering to draw you for a few coins. You nod, and while he sketches, you realize his pencil strokes are watching more than your face. They're recording the way you're watching the room, the way you're noticing details outsiders usually miss. He grins knowingly, as if to say, "Yes, you see it too." And you wonder, is that what binds people in this place? Recognition of lives hidden in plain sight. Outside the street is just as alive. Lanterns hang crooked from balconies, laundry flaps in the chilly air, and children dart between legs chasing stray dogs. Yet even here, you can feel the undercurrent. Montmartre isn't just a neighborhood, it's a stage set where everyone acts a little braver than they do in the daytime. You imagine how different it must feel compared to the quiet, judgment-heavy neighborhoods across the Seine, where even rumors can sink reputations. Here rumors bloom into songs, into laughter, into art that outlives the gossips. You take a deep breath, catching that dizzy mix of smoke perfume and garlic from a nearby kitchen, and it hits you. This is the air of freedom, but only in measured doses. Step too far, and you might still find yourself in the hands of the police, your name printed in a scandal sheet. Step carefully, and you can live nights like this one, where desire hums beneath the brass band, and nobody demands an explanation. And so, as you push your glass aside and stretch your legs beneath the cramped table, you know Montmartre has introduced you to its secret heartbeat. It isn't the beating of drums or the clink of glasses. It's the courage of people daring to be themselves, if only for a night. The night rolls on, and you drift down from Montmartre's noisy hills to a quieter corner where the city's pulse beats in coffee cups. Cafes in 1920s. Paris aren't just places to sip espresso. They're confessionals, without priests, theaters without curtains, and sometimes laboratories where new identities are tested under the forgiving hum of background chatter. You slide into a small wooden chair, its legs uneven on the tiled floor. And the waiter doesn't ask what you want. He just brings you a demi-tasse so dark it feels like drinking midnight. Isn't it funny how a bitter little drink can make people so willing to spill their sweetest secrets? At the next table, notebooks snap open like secret doors. Writers lean close, their pencils scratching faster than the smoke rising from their cigarettes. One man, pale-faced and fidgeting, murmurs lines that never say the word love directly, but paint it in 1,000 colors. Another, with hair flopped across his forehead, sketches cartoonish figures kissing behind lampposts. Each page flipped quickly in case the wrong eyes wander past. You realize these cafes function like coded diaries where truth is written but rarely spoken. You shift your cup and notice a woman 2 tables down. Short hair tucked under a felt cloche tie, knotted at her neck, cigarette dangling at just the right angle. It's not just fashion, it's signal. She laughs too loudly at a joke, and the women beside her lean in, clearly catching more than just humor. When you think about it, isn't clothing sometimes louder than words? In this cafe, ties and cloches shout things that can't yet be printed in the newspapers. The walls are a collage of posters advertising jazz nights, art exhibits, and political debates. Between them, you see little scraps of poetry tacked up, unsigned but brave. One reads, "Love walks here at night, unseen but unashamed." It makes you smile, because isn't that exactly what you've been noticing all evening? People building courage in shadows, leaving breadcrumbs of their hearts, where only those who know the path will find them. There's a ripple of energy when a familiar face steps inside Gertrude Stein. You don't need introductions. You can feel the shift. She carries herself like someone who knows she's rewriting the rules. Beside her, Alice B. Toklas moves with quieter confidence, the kind that doesn't need the spotlight to know it holds the power of a room. They take their seats, and suddenly the cafe isn't just a cafe, it's a salon, a gathering point for artists who will shape not only Paris, but the century. Isn't it wild to think that your latte today might be the backdrop of tomorrow's history books? You lean forward, pretending not to eavesdrop, but hearing anyway. Stein's clipped words dissect novels and paintings, but under the chatter lies a different story. A love that won't find its way into legal records, but thrives between shared glances and half-finished sentences. You sip your coffee slower, now realizing that some of the greatest works of literature are born out of conversations exactly like this. Conversations that carry secrets stronger than the caffeine in your cup. A sudden laugh bursts from a group of young men in the corner. They're arguing about politics, but the one in the striped scarf keeps touching the shoulder of the man beside him, the gesture lingering too long to be just friendly. It's subtle, but then again, cafes are the perfect training grounds for subtlety. Do you think anyone else notices, or do people see only what they're prepared to see? You wonder if the man in the striped scarf will one day write a novel disguising these gestures as metaphors so carefully that readers decades later will need historians to decode them. The hours tick by on the wall clock, its pendulum swinging like a metronome for whispered confessions. A painter nearby sketches a figure with bold strokes, only to smudge it, immediately hiding what he really meant beneath abstract swirls. A poet rips out a page and tucks it into her jacket, eyes darting nervously at the door, as if someone might storm in, demanding proof of what she feels. And all the while, the cafe hums on a sanctuary disguised as a business. You realize that what Montmartre had shouted in saxophones, the cafes now murmur in pen scratches. This is the softer side of rebellion, quieter but no less daring. Here the danger isn't in being seen dancing in feathers, but in being caught writing the wrong word. Yet isn't it true that revolutions often start in whispers before they ever roar in the streets? The waiter circles again, refilling cups without asking, and you glance at the steam rising from your saucer. In that mist, you see not just the room, but the hidden worlds being mapped here, love poems coded in metaphors, friendships doubling as lifelines, reputations balanced on the tip of a pen. You rub your temples and think Paris in the 1920s isn't just building art, it's building a language of survival, one that refuses to disappear even if the ink smears. By the time you've drained your third cup of coffee, the chatter of the cafe fades into the hum of the city, and you find yourself wandering down stairwells that creak like old stage props. The deeper you go into Paris's apartment blocks, the further you step into lives deliberately hidden from the street. Doors here don't open with polite knocks. They crack open just enough to reveal a watchful eye, then shut quickly, unless you're trusted. Isn't it odd how freedom sometimes hides in the tightest, most guarded spaces? You climb narrow steps, the railing sticky with years of palms until you're ushered into a room that smells of ink wine and velvet curtains drawn tight against the outside world. Inside, the atmosphere shifts. It's not a cafe anymore, but a salon alive with voices that don't have to whisper. A small chandelier flickers overhead, and candles lean dangerously close to wax puddles. The furniture is mismatched cushions stolen from half a dozen estates, but nobody notices because everyone is too busy tasting the luxury of honesty. Over there, two women lean against the mantelpiece, laughing with the abandon that comes when you're sure nobody will judge. One of them quotes Sappho in a mock serious tone, and the other claps her hands, calling her a modern priestess of the island of Lesbos. Their joy feels heavier than the smoke in the room, because it's a joy rarely permitted beyond these walls. Can you imagine living a life where laughter itself becomes an act of rebellion? At the piano, a young man plays Gershwin tunes picked up from Americans passing through. His voice cracks, but the others cheer him on, because in this room, performance isn't about polish, it's about trust. You notice how couples inch closer together on the sofas, how hands find each other under tablecloths. Out there on the boulevards, a slip of the wrist could ruin reputations. Here, intimacy moves without chains. It's almost unsettling, like stepping into a parallel Paris where everyone breathes easier. A hush falls as the host clears her throat. She's an actress you vaguely recognize from posters. Her plays are conventional, her reviews polite. But here she introduces poems she'd never dare recite on stage, verses about bodies and longing and the sweetness of secrecy. The group applauds not because the poems are flawless, but because they are true. You think, isn't that the real art, daring to speak what others won't? Someone brings out a tray of cheese and bread, the crust so hard it cracks like old paint. Wine flows, jokes fly, and a painter in the corner sketches quick portraits on scrap paper. He tears one page free, sliding it to a couple across the room, the figures barely hidden behind surreal shapes. They laugh and fold it into a pocket. Here, art doubles as camouflage portraits that outsiders would dismiss as abstract, insiders would cherish as souvenirs of a night lived freely. You notice that despite the laughter, a nervous energy lingers. A door bolt slides shut again and again, as if reassurance must be repeated. Someone warns in a low voice about police raids, about scandals that have cost others their careers. Even in this sanctuary, fear is the uninvited guest. You glance at the window and realize the curtains aren't just decoration, they're shields. Yet within that fragility, something remarkable blooms. These hidden apartments are incubators of resilience. While newspapers rail against moral decline, here people craft new definitions of dignity. When politicians thunder about traditional values, here someone is reading Rimbaud aloud with a grin that says, tradition has already been outpaced. You think of how revolutions often need hidden basements. Before they can step into sunlight, Wasn't the French Revolution itself planned in secret rooms just like this? As the night deepens, the piano fades into soft chords, and you overhear a conversation near the window. A student confesses how exhausting it is to live double lives, how every smile in public is rehearsed. An older man pats his shoulder saying, "Survival itself is a performance, and one day audiences will finally applaud the truth." That phrase sticks with you. Doesn't it sound like a prophecy waiting for its time? You rub your fingers along the armrest, tracing grooves carved by years of similar gatherings. How many hands before yours sought comfort here? How many confessions were made in this very corner? The thought makes the room feel timeless, as if you're sitting in a continuum of voices daring to be free when the world outside demanded silence. Eventually, the candles burn low, and someone cracks the window for air. Cold Paris night spills in, carrying the muffled sound of traffic. Everyone stiffens for a second, waiting to see if the sound is a knock or a threat. When nothing happens, laughter bubbles up again, louder this time like a dare, and you realize every chuckle, every touch, every poem is a declaration that no matter how the law tries to contain them, life will always find its secret apartments to keep breathing. The curtain jerks open, the spotlight hits, and suddenly Paris stops pretending to be subtle. You're in a cabaret where the rules don't just bend, they snap, crackle, and laugh at you while they do it. Isn't it thrilling when a city so polished in daylight lets its wild heart out after dark? The stage is small, the light's a little too hot, but what happens here makes Montmartre's cafes look like polite tea parties. The MC struts out in tails, voice dripping with sarcasm, announcing tonight's acts like a priest reciting litanies. But instead of saints, he's praising the goddess of feathers, the duke of lipstick, and the acrobat who bends not just his body, but society's laws. The crowd roars, clapping hard enough to rattle glasses on the tables, and you seated among them feel a rush of electricity. This isn't just entertainment, it's defiance, dressed in sequins. The first performer steps out a tall figure in a sparkling gown wig piled high like a crown. The spotlight catches rhinestones, turning them into tiny explosions of light. The voice that follows is deep resonant and deliberately at odds with the gown, daring the audience to question their expectations. You hear a few gasps, but they melt into cheers as the performer belts a jazz standard, every note dipped in irony. Isn't it funny how a song you thought you knew suddenly becomes sharper, more daring, when sung in a body society insists should not sing it? As the applause fades, dancers take over, blurring the line between masculine and feminine with every swing of the hips. Some wear suits sharper than bankers, only to toss their jackets aside and reveal corsets glittering underneath. Others flaunt skirts, but the way they stomp their feet on the wooden floor is pure rebellion. You realize these stages are laboratories too, not of science, but of identity places where performers experiment with versions of themselves that the outside world refuses to acknowledge. And the audience, they love it. Couples lean in close, whispering, laughing, clapping in rhythm with the drums. At one table, a woman in pearls nudges her friend and says something that makes them both howl their laughter, mixing with the music like another instrument. At another, a man raises his glass toward the stage, toasting with the seriousness of someone saluting a general. Do you see what's happening here? The cabaret isn't just performance, it's communion. Behind the curtain, you catch glimpses of the offstage chaos. Powder smudged on mirrors, wigs tossed over chairs, stockings hanging like forgotten banners. Performers encourage each other with quick squeezes of the hand, with last-second adjustments to a collar. In those frantic whispers, you realize lies the heartbeat of courage. Out front, the crowd sees glamour. Backstage, you see resilience stitched into every costume. Someone beside you mutters the name of a rising star, Susie Solidor. She'll soon be known across Paris for her smoky voice and her portraits painted by every major artist of the time. Tonight, though, she's just beginning, and you can see the hunger in her eyes as she commands the stage. Her songs aren't about vague romances. They are bold, direct, challenging. She dares to center women in her lyrics, and the room eats it up. Isn't it extraordinary how a voice, just one voice, can rewrite the story everyone else is too afraid to tell? The act that follows takes things further, a parody of a bourgeois wedding, complete with veils and vows. But here, the bride and groom both wink at the audience, switching roles halfway through their exaggerated gestures, mocking the rituals that confine them outside this room. The crowd howls, some pounding the tables in glee. You can't help laughing, too. It's ridiculous, yes, but it's also sharp as a dagger. Beneath the comedy lies critique. If marriage is just performance, why can't everyone perform it in their own way? A sudden hush falls as the final act steps forward. No glitter, no feathers, just a person standing alone with a microphone. They sing slow, low, every word trembling with vulnerability. Unlike the flamboyant numbers, before this, one doesn't need sparkle to shine. The room is silent, every ear straining to catch the ache in the voice. And when the last note fades, the applause is thunderous, not just for the song, but for the bravery of bearing one's soul. You sip your drink, noticing the sticky sweetness left on your lips, and think about how these cabaret nights are more than diversion. They're living proof that when laws and morals press down, art rises higher. The city can try to regulate desire, but it can't regulate applause. Isn't that the irony? Freedom banned on paper thrives under stage lights. As the crowd files out into the night, scarves pulled tight against the chill, the air buzzes with the aftershock of what they've seen. They'll return to their offices, their homes, their roles in daylight. But for now, the echoes of sequins and satire cling to them, reminding you and them that another Paris exists, one where every curtain call is also a small revolution. The night air cools your skin as you leave the cabaret, but Paris doesn't go quiet. It just shifts accents. You wander into the Latin Quarter, where voices mingle in English, Spanish, German, and Italian, a chorus of expatriates who've all decided Paris is the one place where they can live like themselves. Isn't it curious how a foreign city sometimes feels more like home than the one you left behind? At a smoky cafe, you overhear an unmistakable voice. Ernest Hemingway, short sentences fired like bullets, complaining about wine prices while secretly loving every sip. He doesn't speak openly of desire beyond women. His public mask is too thick, but you notice how he lingers in the company of men, how his gaze holds just a fraction too long. His friends laugh loudly, trying to drown any undertones. You realize reputation is everything in this crowd. A careless word can stick harder than ink on paper. Across the room sits Gertrude Stein, again this time, commanding a circle of Americans and Europeans like a general at war. She speaks in her clipped, rhythmic style, dismissing one painter and elevating another. Next to her, Alice Toklas quietly jots notes the details Stein won't bother to remember. They're a pair that baffles outsiders, but feels inevitable once you watch them together. Isn't it striking how love can be both the loudest and quietest presence in the room? At the same time, a young man approaches their table. F. Scott Fitzgerald, jittery, excitable, bouncing between admiration and insecurity. He drinks too much, laughs too hard, and glances sideways as if he's terrified of being left out. You realize this isn't just a literary salon. It's a survival network. Each of these expats has run from something family expectation, small-town gossip, and landed here in Paris, where eccentricity is currency. The conversation drifts to Oscar Wilde, whose tragic fall 2 decades earlier still casts a shadow. Someone raises a glass to him, murmuring about the cost of honesty in the wrong time and place. The table falls silent for a moment, as if everyone feels the ghost of his trials, reminding them to tread carefully. You wonder how much courage does it take to live truthfully when you know exactly how the world punishes it. Later you find yourself at Sylvia Beach's famous bookstore, Shakespeare and Company. It's more than a shop. It's a refuge. The cramped shelves groan under English-language books, the smell of paper mixing with dust and ink. Writers sprawl in corners, scribbling drafts, trading cigarettes, confessing crushes hidden in coded words. Here, queerness isn't announced. It seeps into the margins, into the way poems are read aloud, with a wink into the nervous laughter when someone's story gets too close to autobiography. You catch fragments of a conversation between 2 young poets, one French, one American. They're arguing about whether love should be written plainly or buried in metaphor. The Frenchman insists that truth deserves clarity. The American says, honesty is suicide in print. You sip a watery wine and think, isn't this the eternal battle, to speak openly and risk the world's wrath, or to hide in art and risk never being fully seen? In the corner, a Spanish painter sketches on scrap paper. You recognize the angular lines, the sharp distortions, Picasso, of course. Rumors swirl about his complicated loves, his muses, his constant reinvention. You watch him sketch 2 figures, entwine their features blurred so you can't tell man from woman. He smirks at the drawing, crumples it, and tosses it aside. But for a moment, you wonder if even Picasso is hinting at truths that never make it to exhibitions. The expatriates live hard, drink harder, and talk like their words will rewrite the century. But beneath the bravado lies a quieter story. They are drawn here because Paris allows shadows, because in the shadows they can experiment with who they are. They'll pen novels, paint canvases, compose symphonies, but tucked inside those works are fragments of coded lives, glimpses of loves never printed in the morning papers. As you step outside again, the Seine shimmers under moonlight, and laughter spills from upstairs windows. The expats will carry these nights back into their art, leaving future readers to puzzle over the hints, the metaphors, the glances hidden in sentences. You pause on the bridge, the city humming beneath your feet, and realize you've just glimpsed how much of modern culture was born not just from genius, but from the freedom to live a little closer to truth, even if that truth had to be wrapped in cigarette smoke and whispered behind bookstore doors. You drift further into the night, and suddenly the laughter softens, the jazz fades, and the city shows you its teeth. Paris may celebrate freedom in whispers and stages, but it still carries a badge, a billy club, and a stack of laws. Isn't it always that way? Wherever there's joy, someone is waiting with a rule book to crush it. Down a narrow alley, you hear boots echoing off the cobblestones. A police patrol cuts through the street, their lanterns swinging their eyes scanning for trouble, or at least the kind of trouble they've been ordered to find. Officially, France had repealed its sodomy laws back in the French Revolution, a rare flicker of progressive light. But by the 1920s, morality laws, vague public decency codes, and the heavy hand of gossip still made queer lives precarious. It's one thing to dance in sequins. It's another to be caught outside the cabaret, hand in hand, with no music to disguise you. You step into a cafe that looks ordinary on the outside, but hums with tension inside. Everyone watches the door too closely, conversations dropping the second a new figure appears. At one table, you overhear a painter joke about bribing a policeman with free sketches. At another, a writer mutters about a raid that scattered half his friends the week before. You realize these are people living on the knife's edge between celebration and exposure. Do you ever wonder how exhausting it must be to measure every laugh, every touch against the risk of scandal? On the wall hangs a crumpled newspaper clipping about a recent trial. An aristocrat whose private letters had been leaked, dragging his name through every salon and drawing room in Paris. The punishment isn't prison, but humiliation, exile from polite society. That's the sting of this era, not just the fear of arrest, but the knowledge that reputation could vanish overnight, careers evaporating like cigarette smoke. You glance around and see how people manage the risk. Some cultivate a dual life, presenting one face to society and another in the safety of back rooms. Others lean into eccentricity, hoping that if they're labeled artistic or bohemian, their quirks will be forgiven. It's a delicate dance. Isn't it strange how survival often demands more performance than the stage ever could? A woman near you, sharp-eyed and dressed in tailored wool, leans over to tell a story. She recalls how a police officer stormed into a Montparnasse club only to be met with a chorus of laughter when the dancers refused to scatter. He left red-faced. She chuckles, because what could he do? Arrest half the poets in Paris. The table bursts into applause, but under the humor lies truth. Defiance sometimes worked, but only when numbers gave protection. Alone, anyone could be a target. You think about how uneven the rules were. The poor and working class, gathering in cheap bars, were often the easiest prey. Police could raid, demand bribes, or simply harass without consequence. Wealthier patrons, on the other hand, often escaped with little more than whispers. Isn't it telling how even morality bends when money enters the picture? The tension sharpens when a sudden crash rattles the door. A glass has slipped, nothing more, but the room freezes. Everyone holds their breath until laughter slowly returns. You can feel it in your bones now, the paranoia, the constant weighing of every risk. It's a reminder that even in Paris, the so-called city of love, love came with ledgers, penalties, and an ever-present fear of discovery. And yet the fear never snuffed out the fire. If anything, it pushed people to be more creative. Lovers invented coded signals, from certain flowers worn in buttonholes to the way a scarf was tied. Writers cloaked their desires in allegory, daring readers to decode them. Painters blurred lines, leaving faces ambiguous. Survival became an art form, and in the process, art itself became richer. Doesn't history always show that repression breeds innovation, even if the cost is heavy? As you step back into the street, lantern light spilling across the wet cobblestones, you realize Paris in the 1920s was both refuge and trap. It offered the thrill of freedom, but demanded constant vigilance. Every doorway could open to laughter or to ruin. You pull your coat tighter, not because of the cold, but because you now understand the invisible weight every person here carried on their shoulders. You turn a corner, and suddenly Paris doesn't look like itself at all. The street feels like a runway, and every passerby is dressed like their outfit might be speaking louder than their voice. Isn't it wild how fabric can become a code book, a language only the right eyes can read? You notice it first in the women. Cropped hair, slicked back under felt cloches, a cigarette perched like punctuation at the end of a smirk. Their jackets are tailored sharp shoulders, squared in ways that make them look less like daughters and more like commanders. They're not dressing to be pretty, they're dressing to be legible to one another. You realize that in 1920s, Paris a haircut isn't just fashion, it's declaration. Can you imagine carrying your truth on your head like that, knowing the wrong glance could cost you your reputation? The men carry their codes differently. Some tuck silk scarves into lapels fabrics too luxurious for the drab office clerk they're supposed to be by day. Others exaggerate their elegance wrists. Loose ties, flamboyant cologne, drifting heavier than necessary. The exaggeration itself is a clue, a playful wink to those tuned to the frequency. Isn't it clever how you can turn something as ordinary as a scarf into a flag, visible and invisible at the same time? You duck into a boutique on Rue de la Paix, where mannequins gleam under lamps, each one styled like their daring society to keep up. Behind the counter, a young designer whispers with a client about custom suits that taper in unconventional places. You don't need to overhear every word, you can feel it. These shops are more than businesses. They're workshops of coded courage. Outfits leave here carrying messages as bold as manifestos, even if the police would never understand them. You think of someone like Coco Chanel. She wasn't hiding in shadows. She was smashing them with scissors. She took women out of corsets into trousers, and in doing so, gave queer women a toolkit of camouflage and expression. A woman in trousers in 1910's Paris would have been scandalous. By the 1920s, thanks to Chanel and others, it could be chic. And isn't that the genius of fashion, that it can shift from rebellion to trend, giving cover to those who need it most? At a smoky dance hall, the codes go beyond clothes. Partners switch mid-song, men, spinning men, women pulling women close, and the crowd claps along like it's all just part of the act. But you can tell the tilt of a hat, the looseness of a tie. These are signals, not costumes. They're building a world inside the seams of Parisian nightlife, a world you'd miss entirely if you didn't know how to read it. Even outside the clubs, fashion whispers loudly. Walk along the Seine, and you see women strolling hand in hand, their ties match shoes shined like soldiers. Men lounge on benches, their scarves knotted in ways that catch the eye of anyone passing by who's fluent in this language. To most pedestrians, it looks like eccentricity. To insiders, it's practically a love letter. Doesn't it make you wonder how many truths history has overlooked simply because it didn't know the dress code? In a bookstore window, you catch a display of magazines. Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, glossy covers showing women in cropped hair and slim suits. These images reach beyond Paris, teaching even those who've never stepped into a cabaret how to decode a new kind of elegance. It's fashion, yes, but it's also blueprint carried from one city to another, like contraband. You stop at a mirror in a cafe hallway, adjusting your own collar, and you think about the quiet bravery stitched into every hemline and button. For some, fashion is frivolous, but here in 1920s, Paris, it's survival gear. It lets you test the boundaries of how much of yourself you can show, and how much you must still tuck away. Isn't it extraordinary that an entire identity can hinge on the angle of a hat? The cobblestones beneath your shoes echo a little sharper now, because tonight, Paris wants to remind you that its love affair with secrets sometimes ends in spectacle. You pick up a newspaper from a kiosk, its headlines splashed with scandal, the kind that makes readers spit out their morning coffee. Isn't it strange how a society that thrives on gossip also pretends to be shocked when the whispers turn into ink? Inside, you read about a trial where letters between two men have been exposed. The courtroom becomes theater judges posturing like actors, lawyers delivering monologues, and the public hanging on every lurid detail. The accused isn't facing prison. France technically stopped prosecuting same-sex relations after the revolution, but the punishment of reputation is brutal enough. Careers collapse, invitations vanish, and names are erased from guest lists as if they never existed. Isn't humiliation sometimes the harshest prison of all? You follow the story to a cafe where writers debate whether the press has gone too far. One insists scandal sells papers. Another mutters that journalists are vultures feeding on private lives to keep the boulevards buzzing. And yet you notice how even the critics can't resist leaning closer, asking for details. Gossip isn't just currency here. It's entertainment cheaper than theater tickets. In one corner, an artist sketches caricatures of the trial, participants turning stern judges into clowns, and solemn lawyers into squawking roosters. The crowd howls with laughter, but underneath the humor is fear. Everyone knows that today it's the aristocrat or the politician on trial. Tomorrow, it could be the poet, the dancer, or even the patron, laughing the loudest. Doesn't it make you wonder how people live with such a sword dangling above them? You recall Oscar Wilde's fate in London decades earlier, how his letters and love turned into evidence against him. Paris had watched from across the channel, tut-tutting, while secretly devouring every detail. Now in the 1920s, the city pretends it's different, more tolerant, more avant-garde. But when scandals erupt, the appetite is the same. Audiences gather for the spectacle, eager to condemn, while secretly thrilled. One story sticks with you, a singer whose private correspondence leaked, splashed across tabloids in bold letters. Her career dimmed overnight bookings, canceled, fans turned cold. Yet in hidden clubs, she kept performing for smaller, braver crowds. People whispered her songs with admiration, humming them like protest chants. Isn't it remarkable how resilience sometimes hides in melody, defying the silence demanded by society? You walk past a courthouse one morning, its stone steps stained with cigarette butts, left by reporters and gawkers. Inside, a trial drones on, about morality, but outside the city continues to hum with its usual contradictions. Lovers still meet in parks, cafes still buzz with coded laughter, and artists still paint portraits that disguise truths in brushstrokes. The courtroom may thunder about shame, but Paris refuses to erase its desires entirely. A group of students passes you on the steps, waving a pamphlet that rails against hypocrisy. They point out how politicians wag their fingers in court while sneaking into the same cabarets at night. Their sarcasm is biting, their laughter sharper than the judge's gavel. Isn't that the irony that the very people condemning others are often the ones living double lives themselves? Later that evening, back in Montparnasse, you hear a poet recite a new piece in a smoky bar. His words are thinly veiled, but everyone knows what they mean. He's mocking the trial-turning scandal into satire, transforming humiliation into art. The audience claps half in admiration, half in relief that truth can still be spoken even if disguised as metaphor. And you realize every trial, every tabloid headline, every public shaming only adds another layer to the underground resilience of this city. The louder the accusations outside, the stronger the determination inside to keep living, loving, and creating. Paris thrives on contradictions, and nowhere is that clearer than in the way it punishes and celebrates desire in the same breath. The headlines fade behind you, and once again, you're walking streets where life is lived, not in courtrooms or stages, but in fleeting touches and hurried glances. Everyday Paris, the bakeries, the tram stops, the narrow alleys, carries its own quiet stories. Isn't it always the ordinary spaces that end up hiding the most extraordinary lives? You find yourself in Pigalle, a neighborhood humming with cabarets, but also with grocers and children darting between lampposts. By day, it's just another district of Paris. By night, it becomes a maze of encounters. You notice two men pausing at a newsstand, their eyes never meeting directly, yet their shoulders brush as they both reach for the same magazine. To passers-by, it's nothing, just a coincidence. But you see it, the silent choreography of people negotiating desire in public. Further along, a pair of women stroll arm in arm, their laughter bubbling over the sound of clattering horse-drawn carts. No one stares too long. In Paris, women walking together can pass as friendship, a convenient camouflage. Yet you notice how their fingers occasionally knot together, a small rebellion against invisibility. Isn't it astonishing how much meaning can hide in something as simple as a handhold? You duck into a boulangerie, the smell of fresh bread wrapping around you like a blanket. The baker, a round-faced man with flour dusting his sleeves, greets everyone the same, but his eyes soften when a certain customer arrives. You watch the exchange, an extra loaf slipped into the bag, a grin held just a second too long. It's tender, almost domestic, and you realize that even under the weight of laws and gossip, everyday affection still sneaks its way into the corners of life. On a tram, rattling toward the left bank, you sit beside a group of students arguing about politics. Their voices are loud, dismissing capitalism, praising socialism, mocking anyone who disagrees. But as the tram jolts, you notice how one of them steadies the other, with a hand that lingers on the knee longer than necessary. Their debate rages on words clashing like cymbals, yet underneath it all, there's the quiet thrum of something unspoken. Isn't it funny how love sometimes whispers louder than ideology? The markets are no different. Among stalls piled with apples and turnips, you see coded exchanges, scarves, adjusted hats, tipped glances held. These aren't grand romances, but they matter. They're the stitches that hold a community together, invisible threads weaving through the noise of buying and selling. In a smoky cafe off Boulevard Saint-Germain, a waiter rolls his eyes at customers dawdling over single cups of coffee. Yet he doesn't notice or pretends not to notice two men at the corner table exchanging sketches of each other across the paper napkins. Their laughter is quiet, but their joy fills the space more completely than the accordion wheezing in the background. You wonder how many of these cafes doubled as meeting grounds, how many napkins carried sketches, or poems meant for only two sets of eyes. Even the parks play their part. In Luxembourg, garden shadows stretch long at dusk, and benches become islands of possibility. You sit pretending to read and catch the flicker of a smile passed between strangers on opposite benches. They'll circle closer with each lap around the gravel paths, timing it so casually that no passerby would notice. Isn't it remarkable how a city can be both playground and camouflage at once? And of course, there are the rooftops. Climb high enough, and Paris spreads out like a sea of slate and chimneys. Lovers meet here too, tucked away from patrols and prying eyes. From up here, the city looks almost innocent, its secrets hidden beneath layers of tile and smoke. You think about how many windows below conceal similar stories, how many quiet apartments are filled with whispered laughter the world will never record. As you make your way back toward the Seine, you realize the truth. Queerness in 1920s Paris wasn't confined to cabarets or scandals. It pulsed in the bakeries, rode the trams, lingered in parks, and lived in the smallest gestures of daily life. Ordinary streets held extraordinary courage, and every glance, every brush of a hand, every smuggled smile was part of a larger unspoken chorus. Here's the last surprise Paris has been saving for you. The night stretches into pale morning, and as you stand on the Pont Neuf, the first rays of sun slip across the Seine. Isn't it poetic that the city famous for its light always hides its deepest truths in the dark, only to reveal them at dawn? The water reflects not just bridges and domes, but every story you've gathered in your walk. Cabarets, where drag queens mock society with sequins cafes, where writers scribbled confessions in code-hidden salons, where laughter was a form of defiance, and street corners, where a single brush of hands carried more weight than sermons. The city hums around you, oblivious, but you know you've been watching its secret heart all along. You lean on the cold stone railing and think of the people you've glimpsed. Jean Cocteau scribbling metaphors sharp enough to cut glass. Gertrude Stein commanding circles while Alice Toklas recorded the world in her careful silence. Susie Solidor daring to sing what others would not. Ordinary bakers slipping extra loaves, students arguing politics while their hands told another story. Women in cloche hats walking arm in arm under the pretense of friendship. Don't you see it now? This wasn't just subculture, it was culture shaping Paris, even as Paris pretended not to notice. The truth is, the legend of Paris, the city of art, love, and freedom, owes as much to these hidden lives as to the boulevards and monuments. Without the courage of those who dressed differently, wrote differently, loved differently, would Paris still glitter with the same allure? You realize that the untold history isn't untold at all. It's been whispered all along, waiting for someone willing to listen. The bells of Notre Dame toll across the waters steady and ancient, and for a moment you wonder how many of the faithful who built such cathedrals carried secrets in their own hearts. History likes to polish monuments, but it often scrubs away the fingerprints of people who lived outside the script. Isn't it time to admit that their fingerprints shape the stone just as much as any chisel? A fisherman casts his line from the embankment. Children shuffle off to school, and carriages rattle across bridges. The day looks ordinary, but you can't unsee what you've seen. You know that beneath the bread deliveries and morning bells lies a city that dared to live in shadows, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. And in those shadows, it carved out a freedom more real than anything proclaimed in speeches. The wind catches your coat as you take one last look at the horizon. Paris has shown you its secrets, but it hasn't confessed them. It never will. That's the paradox. Its beauty lies not in its openness, but in its endless ability to hold contradictions, repression and liberation, shame and celebration, scandal and art. Isn't that, after all, why people still call it the City of Light? Because light only means something when you know what it's illuminating and what it's hiding. You turn away from the railing steps echoing across the bridge, carrying with you the quiet realization that history isn't just written in laws or trials or headlines. It's written in the courage of those who dared to laugh, to dance, to hold hands in the wrong places at wrong times. And though they lived in whispers, the echoes remain rippling through time, until even you, a century later, can still feel them in the morning air. Paris in the 1920s was more than jazz fashion and smoky cafes. It was a city alive with secrets. Hidden salons, daring cabarets, and whispered glances revealed how love and desire thrived even under judgment and scandal. These untold stories shaped the legend of Paris as a place of freedom and art. And speaking of scandal, let's turn the spotlight even brighter. The most scandalous love affairs of 1920s Paris, where passion collided with fame and shook the city. You arrive in Montparnasse just as the clock strikes midnight, and the city feels like it's exhaling cigarette smoke and saxophone notes in equal measure. Picture yourself walking through narrow streets where lamps sputter and blink, and the sidewalks buzz with painters, poets, and expats clutching their last francs until payday. And here's the hook. Paris in the 1920s is not the city of polite cafe chatter and postcards. It's the city of scandalous whispers that throb louder than the trumpet player on stage. You are stepping into a world where gossip is currency, where affairs are negotiated over cocktails, and where a love triangle can feel as important as a treaty signed at Versailles. You push open the door of La Rotonde, and the place is thick with jazz, brassy, improvised, slightly drunk jazz. At one table, Ernest Hemingway is loudly criticizing a rival sentence structure, while his wife Hadley glances nervously at a woman across the room. At another, artists in berets argue about Picasso's newest canvas that looks less like a woman and more like a pile of furniture. You realize quickly that no one here is just married or single. Everybody seems to be linked, involved, separated, but not really. Or in that gray zone, Paris perfected. Can you imagine opening your Instagram feed and finding your favorite author casually posing with two lovers in the same frame? No shame, just another Thursday night. That's Montparnasse in the 20s, but with absinthe instead of hashtags. Your senses are overwhelmed. The floor is sticky with spilled wine, but the air is sweet with perfume from women who've stopped obeying the corset and started obeying only their whims. You hear Josephine Baker's name tossed around, even though she's mostly performing across town at the Folies Bergère. You catch a scrap of gossip some banker's wife has run off with a poet, and the banker pretends not to mind as long as the checks keep clearing. What shocks you most isn't the betrayal, it's how casually people treat it. Affairs aren't dark secrets here. They're accessories, flaunted like a new pair of silk gloves. Outside, Montparnasse Boulevard hums with even more scandal than the cafe. Couples duck into taxis, whispering to drivers to take them anywhere but home. On the corner street, musicians play melancholic violin, while watching lovers stumble past their laughter, betraying secrets they'll regret in the morning. It makes you wonder, were these artists creating great work because of their affairs, or in spite of them? Did heartbreak fuel the masterpieces, or was it just the side effect of living too intensely? As you stroll past the Dome Cafe, you notice how the walls practically drip with cigarette smoke and jealousy. You see a painter sketching a woman at the bar, his own girlfriend, sitting 3 stools away, pretending not to notice. It feels like the entire district runs on adrenaline and infidelity. But instead of hiding it, Paris wears it openly, like a feather boa wrapped around its shoulders. Think of it like modern celebrity culture. You read about messy breakups in magazines, but in the 1920s, you could actually sit one table away from the chaos as it unfolded. And then, of course, there's the music. Jazz was the perfect soundtrack for these affairs, fast, unpredictable, impossible to keep steady. Sidney Bechet's clarinet wails through the night. And it's not just entertainment. It's a mood that justifies bad decisions. You find yourself thinking, maybe Paris invented the concept of its complicated long before Facebook put it into a drop-down menu. The deeper you walk, the more you notice how each corner has its own scandal. The Montparnasse Cemetery itself holds stories lovers meeting under the shadow of gravestones, promising eternity, while their current partners wait unknowingly at home. You can't help but smirk at the irony eternal promises whispered in the most temporary of arrangements. Is it foolish? Yes. Is it romantic? Also yes. In the cafes, gossip races faster than the waiters. Did you hear about Kiki de Montparnasse, the model who posed for everyone and loved almost as freely? Did you hear about the Duchess caught sneaking out with a painter half her age? Everyone talks, yet no one judges too harshly, because tomorrow the story could be about them. Scandal isn't an exception here. It's a rhythm, just like the syncopated beat of the jazz bands echoing down the boulevard. It strikes you that Montparnasse in the 1920s wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a stage. And every scandalous affair, every stolen kiss, every public fight was part of the performance. The writers, painters, dancers, and dreamers weren't only creating art for galleries and bookshelves. They were living art, messy, chaotic, intoxicating art that spilled out into the streets and made Paris throb with energy. And as you lean against the doorframe of another cafe, half asleep from wine, and the hour you realize the night is just beginning, you drift from the smoky boulevard into a narrower lane, and the buzz of gossip fades into the hush of a small studio. The red glow hits you first. It's the dim light of Man Ray's darkroom, where rolls of film hang like secret laundry, dripping with images that will scandalize Paris by morning. And in the middle of it all is Kiki, the so-called Queen of Montparnasse, her laughter as loud as the shutter clicks. This isn't the kind of love story you'd expect from a polite museum wall. This is a mess of passion, jealousy, and art that burns too bright to last. You notice how Kiki poses not as a timid subject, but as a co-creator. When Man Ray tells her to hold still, she tilts her head with defiance, daring the camera to capture more than skin, daring it to capture her chaos, her freedom. How many muses in history get to fight back, to leave their fingerprints on the art that supposedly just uses them? Not many. And yet here, in this little room that smells of chemicals and turpentine, Kiki is both muse and master lover and legend. The gossip about them swirls outside the studio walls, fights so loud the neighbors bang on the ceiling, reconciliations just as dramatic, and photographs that look almost too intimate to be shared. But they are shared, projected, published, sold, and each print carries with it the ghost of their affair. You can't help but ask yourself, was Paris obsessed with the art or the scandal behind it? When you see Kiki's face peering from a surreal photograph with a violin painted on her back, do you admire the technique, or do you secretly wonder what happened after the camera stopped clicking? Their relationship is intoxicating because it's unstable. Imagine two people building a house on quicksand. Each wall they raise together just sinks a little with every argument. Kiki drinks too much. Ray sulks too long. And yet they return to each other, like moths circling the same flame. Isn't it curious how some loves feel less like comfort and more like combustion? And yet neither side wants to escape. Man Ray himself is a puzzle. To some, he's the genius of surreal photography, bending reality with lenses and shadows. To others, he's a man consumed by jealousy, especially when other artists paint Kiki, or when she dares to flirt at the Rotonde. And Kiki doesn't help matters. She thrives in attention, like a sunflower, thrives in sunlight, turning her face to whichever admirer is nearest. Some evenings, she sings in cabarets, her voice scratchy but full of soul, while Ray fumes in the corner, convinced the applause belongs to him somehow. Yet the photographs endure even when their relationship doesn't. One image shows Kiki with her eyes closed, serene, almost saintly, yet serenity was the last thing on either of their minds. Another captures her mid-laugh, a reminder that joy can survive even the ugliest fights. Maybe that's why their art still matters. It's honest about the mess. Today we scroll past polished selfies that hide the fights happening off camera. But in the 1920s, Man Ray's negatives revealed the tension, the cracks, the human truth behind the glamour. Walking out of the studio, you feel the clash between love and creation lingering in your chest. Was Kiki just another muse destined to fade into the background of a man's biography? Or was she, in fact, the reason the biography shines at all? Paris seemed to know the answer. Even decades later, people still whisper her name, not just his. And in the hum of Montparnasse, their affair becomes another reminder that the 1920s wasn't about tidy marriages or noble romances. It was about fire, about the refusal to live small, even if it meant burning down your own peace. You don't have to walk far before another name rises above the Parisian hum. Colette. She isn't just a writer. You can almost hear her pen scratching in the night, pouring secrets onto the page that scandalize breakfast tables the next morning. And here's the thing, her life is as dramatic as her novels. The woman who once wrote about Claudine kissing schoolgirls on stage decides not only to write the script, but also to live it unapologetically right in front of Paris. You catch sight of her in a smoky theater where audiences lean forward, breathless, waiting for her to break another taboo. Colette doesn't disappoint. When she kisses her female co-star on stage, the applause isn't polite, it's thunderous, shocked and slightly nervous, as if the crowd can't decide whether to cheer or cross themselves. Imagine a Broadway show today that turns every social norm upside down, and you'll have a taste of what Colette was doing in 1907 and still doing in the Roaring '20s when everyone finally caught up. But the theater scandal is just Act 1. In Act 2, Colette's personal life grabs headlines with even more force. She marries, divorces, remarries, and then, in one of those twists that Paris eats up like croissants, she begins an affair with her stepson. Yes, you heard that right. Bertrand de Juvenel, the teenage son of her husband. Paris gasps. Paris gossips, and Paris keeps buying her books. It's messy, it's controversial, but it's also Colette's way of refusing to be boxed in by the rules that suffocate other women of her era. Walking behind her, you notice how she carries herself through the scandal, not with shame, but with a cat-like grace, the same grace that made her famous for writing about feline independence. She knows that people are whispering, but she also knows that whispering keeps her name alive. Doesn't it make you wonder how many writers today would dare to make their private lives as bold as their prose? What's striking is how Colette turns every affair, every heartbreak, every raised eyebrow into fuel for her art. She writes with an intimacy that feels like confession, but it's also a performance, every word calibrated to sting and seduce at the same time. Her readers don't just consume her novels, they consume her as if the boundary between writer and character has completely evaporated. Isn't that what scandal really is? The blurring of lines between what you do and what you are. Even the French government eventually admits she's more than just gossip fodder. In her later years, she's honored with a state funeral, the first French woman to receive one. Think about that, the same woman condemned for kissing on stage and for her scandalous love life is eventually celebrated as a national treasure. It's proof that sometimes the very things society punishes you for are the same things that decades later make you unforgettable. You step back out onto the boulevard, the sound of her reputation still buzzing in your ears. Colette's life reminds you that Paris in the 1920s wasn't just about artists painting or jazz musicians improvising. It was about women claiming their own stage, even if they had to ignite scandals to do it. And as you drift further down the street, the night opens again, offering yet another story waiting in the smoke. Imagine a love triangle so sharp it could slice through ski slopes, a tangle so intense it nearly derails the career of one of America's most famous novelists before it even begins. You board a train heading out of Paris snow, whipping past the windows, and there's Ernest Hemingway, with Hadley, his first wife, sitting dutifully beside him. But just across the aisle, glowing with a mix of charm and quiet ambition, is Pauline Pfeiffer, the friend who will become rival, the guest who will become replacement. You can almost feel the frost settling not just outside on the Alps, but inside the carriage. Hadley is warm, steady the anchor who followed Hemingway from Chicago to Paris, selling her own belongings so he could chase his dream of becoming a writer. Pauline, on the other hand, is wealthy, fashionable, and keenly aware of her allure. She's the kind of person who doesn't just enter a room, she tilts it in her direction. And Hemingway, whose ego was already large enough to fill a cafe, suddenly finds himself trapped between two women who embody two versions of the life he wants. Isn't it ironic how the man who could wrestle words into place on a page struggled so badly to keep his heart or his loyalties in order? On the snowy slopes, the tension sharpens. You watch as Hadley skis a little behind her cheeks, red from the cold, while Pauline carves effortlessly beside Ernest, laughing at his jokes. The air is crisp, but the atmosphere is suffocating. A bystander might think they're simply friends vacationing together, but anyone paying attention can see the shift. The stolen glances, the subtle brushes of hands, the way Hemingway's laugh changes when Pauline is the audience. It's the kind of discomfort you recognize even today, like scrolling through social media, noticing a friend suddenly commenting a little too much on your partner's posts. Different century, same sting. The affair doesn't explode all at once. It creeps in slowly like frostbite. Hemingway starts spending more time with Pauline under the guise of literary discussions. Hadley senses the drift, but tries to remain loyal, perhaps hoping the man she believed in will steady himself again. And yet Paris thrives on whispers, and soon the cafes are buzzing with rumors that the great Ernest Hemingway can't even manage his own domestic plotline. Can you imagine being the talk of Montparnasse, not because of your stories, but because of your story? The scandal culminates in a moment both tragic and absurd. On one trip, Hadley accidentally leaves behind a suitcase full of Ernest's manuscripts, everything he'd been working on lost in a blink. Some say it was absent-mindedness. Others whisper it was symbolic that the weight of their unraveling marriage made her careless. Whatever the reason, it's as if fate itself had intervened, erasing his work, just as his personal life was about to be erased too. Pauline steps in, soon after offering comfort that blossoms into a marriage once Hadley steps aside. And what becomes of Hadley? She leaves Paris heartbroken, but dignified later, finding happiness away from Hemingway's shadow. Pauline takes her place, walking proudly beside the writer as his star rises higher, only to discover later that Hemingway's hunger for passion never stays satisfied with one plate. The irony, Hadley, the so-called loser in this love triangle, is remembered today with a kind of soft respect, while Pauline is often cast as the interloper. History, it seems, has its own way of taking sides. As you watch the train pull back into Paris, you feel the quiet echo of betrayal rattling on the tracks. Hemingway's affair is more than a gossip column. It's a reminder that even the giants of literature stumbled in love, often in ways that still make you shake your head a century later. And as you step off onto the platform, the smoke from the locomotive mingles with the city's eternal haze, drawing you forward into the next scandal waiting just beyond the crowd. You barely shake the snow off your coat before another storm hits this one, not of weather, but of gin, glitter, and jealousy. Enter Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, the couple who make Paris lean in with equal parts fascination and pity. If Hemingway's triangle was sharp, the Fitzgeralds' marriage is a carousel spinning too fast, its horses painted with envy, ambition, and intoxication. You step into a Montparnasse bar, where Scott orders champagne he can't afford, while Zelda twirls on the dance floor as if the music is hers alone. And the hook of their story is this two people who adore each other so deeply that they can't stop competing, bruising, and breaking in the process. Zelda is not content to be just the wife of a writer. She's a writer herself, a dancer, a dreamer, who refuses to shrink into Scott's shadow. But Scott, already insecure about being labeled a popular author rather than a serious one, bristles whenever Zelda shines too brightly. You notice the way he winces when someone laughs too hard at her quips, or when her dancing gets more attention than his manuscript. Isn't it strange how love can twist into rivalry when both people crave the spotlight? And then there's the rumored pilot, a French aviator, who may or may not have become Zelda's distraction when Scott's drinking made him impossible to live with. The details are hazy, but the whispers are loud. Paris doesn't care about evidence. It cares about drama. And drama is something the Fitzgeralds supply in abundance. Arguments spill out of hotel lobbies. Accusations fly across cafes. And yet the next night, there they are again, arm in arm, dazzling and destructive all at once. Theirs is not just a marriage. It's a public performance. Scott mines. Zelda's words, her diary entries, even her conversations for material, inserting her lines into his novels, without always admitting their origin. Zelda Furious responds with her own writing, accusing him of theft, not just of her words, but of her very life. You can almost hear her voice sharp and unapologetic. You plagiarized me. Imagine scrolling through best-selling novel today, only to recognize entire passages lifted from your private journal. Would you laugh, cry, or sue? Despite the battles, they remain inseparable, bound by something magnetic and destructive. The parties they throw become legend champagne towers, spilling gramophones, scratching jazz until dawn, neighbors banging on walls to no avail. And yet, beneath the glitter lies exhaustion. Zelda, struggling with her mental health, begins to unravel. Scott, drinking harder than ever, pushes himself toward collapse. You realize the scandal isn't just about who loved whom. It's about what happens when two brilliant flames burn each other out in public view. Walking away from their scene, you wonder, were they victims of their own ambitions or of a society eager to watch beautiful people self-destruct? The Fitzgeralds remind you that Paris in the 20s wasn't just champagne sparkle. It was also broken glass on the floor, glitter sticking to tears and hangovers that lasted far longer than the applause. And as their laughter fades into the night air, you sense another voice rising from the cabarets, a woman whose power will electrify the city in a way no novelist could. You follow the hum of conversation down the boulevard, and suddenly the night erupts into spotlight and rhythm. The curtain lifts, and there she is, Josephine Baker, shimmering in sequins, moving with a speed and daring that leaves the audience gasping. The room doesn't just watch her, it worships her. The scandal tonight isn't hidden in corners or whispered in cafes. It's front and center on stage, delivered with a grin, a shimmy, and a banana skirt that Paris will never forget. Josephine is more than a performer. She's an event. You can almost feel the room's pulse quicken with each of her spins, as if the whole city has decided to orbit around her. Imagine walking into a club today and seeing a TikTok star perform live, only magnified by the sheer charisma of someone rewriting the rules in real time. And yet, behind the applause, there's something else, an endless murmur about her private life. Who is she with tonight? Is it her manager, her fellow dancer, or someone new she met after the show? In Paris, Josephine's romances are as famous as her dances. Backstage, the glamour turns into intimacy. You catch a glimpse of her laughing with her manager-lover, Pepito Abatino, who guides her career with a mix of devotion and calculation. Their relationship is both professional and personal, tangled like stage lights and cords impossible to separate cleanly. The gossip columns feast on it, hinting at breakups, reconciliations, and triangles that blur the line between love and business. And Josephine, she seems to thrive in the chaos, as if each headline is another spotlight aimed her way. Her life is a series of contradictions. She is adored by Paris, but criticized in her native America, where segregation still bars her from hotels and restaurants. Here in the City of Light, she walks with dukes, dines with artists, and romances whoever she pleases, as though scandal is just another feather in her costume. Isn't it fascinating how a city that once frowned at Colette's kisses now applauds Josephine for breaking even bigger boundaries? Paris has learned that shock sells tickets, and Josephine is the hottest ticket in town. You lean closer, watching her rehearse. Offstage, she's not just a dancer, but a strategist. She knows which moves will ignite applause, which costumes will spark headlines, which lovers will keep her name on everyone's lips. In a way, Josephine invents the blueprint for the modern celebrity, someone who turns both talent and personal life into a performance. And you wonder, is she living freely? Or is she trapped in the role the world demands of her? The scandal of her affairs isn't really about who she loves. It's about how openly she loves. A woman in the 1920s, black bisexual poor-born, rising to wealth and fame every step she takes, defies the categories others try to trap her in. Each romance, each rumor, is another declaration. I will not be confined. And the audience, whether cheering or whispering, cannot look away. As you step back onto the boulevard, the echo of drums still in your chest, you realize Josephine's power wasn't just in the way she danced. It was in the way she dared to be everything society said she couldn't be: lover star, scandal legend. And the city, hungry for its next obsession, was more than willing to let her lead the dance. Imagine a genius who can flatten time-bend bodies into angles and still fail to keep his own house from splitting down the middle. You push open the door to an atelier that smells like turpentine and oranges, and there he is, Pablo Picasso, short, quick-eyed, already a legend, shifting canvases the way a magician palms cards. On one wall, the elegant ballerina wife, Olga Koklova, poise and porcelain. On another wall, a new curve of light, a secret face that keeps reappearing under different colors. You don't need a caption to sense it. Love here is a studio with 2 windows and a draft between them. Olga first. You see her in a white dress, back straight as a metronome, the discipline of the ballets russes still in her shoulders. Married to Picasso, in 1918 she brings a kind of classical calm to the early 1920s paintings. Neoclassical lines, dignified profiles, a hush that suggests civility. But the hush doesn't last. Paris grows louder. Picasso grows restless, and the distance creeps in like winter fog. You watch Olga leafing through a fashion magazine, while a canvas across the room shows her face as a fragment, as if serenity itself could be chipped. Isn't it strange how domestic quiet can sound louder than an argument when a painter starts muttering with his brush? Now, turn slightly different wall, different weather. In 1927, outside galleries, Lafayette Picasso meets Marie-Thérèse Walter, a teenager, whose profile, the sweeping nose, the crescent chin, will haunt his canvases for years. The affair becomes a secret gallery. Within the public, one hidden initials, interlaced letters, beach scenes, where joy is a geometry of sun-soft curves. You notice the color temperature change. Warm violets and lemon yellows begin to glow, like late afternoon. If Olga is measured in lines, Marie-Thérèse arrives in waves. Have you ever scrolled your photo roll and seen the exact moment your mood changed? Painters do that on walls. Picasso moves between worlds the way he moves between palettes. Morning formal lunches on the right bank. Olga composed acquaintances nodding at the famous couple. Afternoon, the studio where sketches tumble out like confessions. Evening, a rented room. A clandestine swim, a sculpture made from bicycle handles that suddenly looks suspiciously like a smile. The arrangement would make any calendar app glitch. And yet Paris in the 20s is unusually good at pretending not to see what it absolutely sees. Remember how Montparnasse treated affairs like accessories. Here discretion is a style choice, like a hat you tip just so. The canvases begin to argue for him. One day, you find Olga's face tightened into hard planes. Elegance strained, the palette cooling. Another day, you find a sleeping figure, head tilted back, as if the room itself breathes around her, Marie-Thérèse's silhouette, though the label doesn't say it. Picasso doesn't write diary entries. He stacks them. The studio is his gossip column, and the brush is mercilessly honest even when the man is not. Do you trust what someone tells you, or what they make when they forget to perform? That question hums in the turpentine. Paul Rosenberg stops by the dealer with a keen eye and an even keener ledger. He tracks prices, arranges shows, pretends to ignore the personal storms as long as the paintings are cyclones. He knows that scandal can raise demand, but it can also break supply. Olga wants stability. Genius rarely offers warranties. You watch as Rosenberg squints at a portrait that doesn't so much depict a woman as reconstruct the idea of wanting one. Paris predictably wants to buy the idea. Olga's world and Marie-Thérèse's world sometimes lie inches apart on the same easel, and the tension turns stylistic. Classicism versus curves control versus flow marble versus fruit. When Picasso draws, Olga lines sharpen like frost on glass. When he draws, Marie-Thérèse forms round off into cushions of air. You don't need a gossip sheet. You need a color wheel. Isn't it wild how the same hand can make love look like a column one day and a hammock the next? The personal consequences seep through the floorboards. Olga, never just a subject, feels the draft. The marriage phrase, rooms become territories, dinners go silent, friends choose chairs carefully. Meanwhile, the hidden studio afternoons multiply drawings as if graphite were a second heartbeat. You might ask, could the art have existed without the secret history rarely answers gently? It shrugs and points at canvases that still throb a century later. Step closer to a 1920s sketchbook. There are bicycles by the Marne, a tennis racket leaning in a corner, the kind of summer scene that smells of sunscreen, if sunscreen had existed in that exact scent back then. Marie-Thérèse swims. The water makes her limbs into commas. Picasso, who once fractured bodies into cubes, now lets them slip and recline like single sentences. He is still the architect of angles, but desire has loosened his grammar. You think of Josephine's stage from earlier, the way a performance can change the room's oxygen. In this studio, the performance is color, and the oxygen is secrecy. Outside, the decade keeps its beat, jazz scooters, cafe clatter, but in here, the metronome ticks against two tempos. One, the practiced rhythm of Olga's formal world. Two, the improvisation of a new muse. The painter tries to ride both, and the paintings wobble between etiquette and appetite. You remember Colette turning scandal into literature, Hemingway sorting feelings into trains and winters. Picasso's version is a wall that refuses to pick a side. How many lives can a single studio hold before the light gets crowded? You step back until the two walls fall into a single field of vision. This is the uncomfortable truth. The canvases are brilliant, and the circumstances are thorny. The art that dazzles also documents a web of choices with shadows attached. You're not asked to approve. You're asked to look at the tenderness that softened a famously hard style, at the cruelty of a triangle that never quite resolves, at the way color can smile while a household clenches. History has a tired way of calling this the price of genius. You can call it a room where love and paint refuse to stay in their lanes. By the time you reach the stairwell, you can still see two faces in the mind's frame, one held together by poise, the other by light, as if the city had learned to keep both portraits in circulation without admitting how they overlap. The hallway air smells of dust and linseed. Somewhere outside, a horn answers another horn, then fades. You step off the noisy boulevard into a courtyard that smells of damp stone and jasmine, and the city's tempo drops, as if someone placed a velvet finger on the gramophone needle. A lantern winks. The garden at 20 Rue Jacob opens like a stage whisper, and there between hedges pruned with architectural confidence waits a tiny neoclassical pavilion, half-jokingly called the Temple of Friendship. Tonight friendship wears silk. You've arrived at Natalie Clifford Barney's salon, the weekly gathering where women come to read, argue, flirt, and rewire the circuitry of literature without asking anyone's permission. If Montparnasse runs on trumpet and bravado, this garden hums on syllables and side glances. Barney is already in motion, a small comet in a pale gown, American by birth, Parisian by choice, and theatrical by design. Her calling card is short, epigrams sharper than hatpins. Her mission statement's even shorter. Women's genius belongs in daylight. She hosts on Fridays outdoors, whenever weather allows, because gardens imply growth, and growth implies inevitability. You catch her quoting herself with a smile. Why confide in a man what one can confide in a woman? And the listeners ripple with that particular laughter that means recognition more than amusement. Isn't it pleasant when a room or a hedge maze finally sounds like it's on your wavelength? Romaine Brooks lingers near the stone bench, self-contained as always, all grayscale elegance and hawk-quiet eyes. Painter-partner weather system. While Barney handles the crowd, Romaine handles the atmosphere. In her portraits, cool, spare, and somehow louder for being muted, women look back at you with a calm that reads like defiance. You recognize her palette from posters and museum cards, moonlit whites against storm cloud blacks, dignity sculpted out of restraint. If Josephine Baker is the city's spotlight, Romaine is its midnight lens, and Barney knows how to stand in both. Someone mentions Renée Vivien, and the garden tilts more inward. Vivian, born Pauline Tarn, was the early love who turned Barney's ideas into poems that gleam like icicles. The affair is history by the 1920s, but the ghost of it turns up whenever a line is read aloud. Vivian's verses, all swans, and night water, and fierce vows, once made newspapers blush, and readers whisper that Sappho had returned in evening gloves. The end was sorrow, illness drink a life shortened, and even the leaves seem to absorb the ache. Barney keeps her memory here, like a pressed flower in a heavy book, not to sentimentalize it, but to say, this mattered, and it still does. The evening loosens into its pattern, a poem under the plane trees, a spirited quarrel by the pavilion, a stroll to the tea table that resembles a small diplomatic summit. A newcomer reads 3 stanzas hands shaking. An established novelist nods with the slow approval that writers recognize as currency. Colette sometimes appears amused to watch a different arena of courage. Gertrude Stein, with her own imperious salon across town, will be referenced with a mixture of rivalry and respect to Queen's different courts. Paris, generous to gossip, has room for more than one throne. Barney's garden has rules that look like freedom. Lovers may quarrel, but not loudly enough to interrupt a sentence. Opinions may duel, but only with wit, never with cruelty. The Académie Française will not admit women. Fine Natalie invents the Académie des Femmes and prints invitations as neatly as a manifesto. She believes that institutions can be replaced by soirées if the soirees run long enough. You recognize the modern playbook here. If the door doesn't open, throw a party in the yard until the door becomes awkward. A question floats from the chairs, soft but pointed. Must love be discreet to be serious? Heads turn. Barney, who has mastered the art of answering while rearranging flowers, decides it should be visible, yes, but still written with style. She dislikes secrecy when it shrinks a person, but she values discretion when it frames a person. Think of it like photo editing for dignity. Public enough to affirm, private enough to protect. In a decade that pretends to be fearless, while counting who sits with whom, such calibration isn't hypocrisy. It's survival. Juna Barnes drifts in from the shadows like a riddle wearing pearls. She listens more than she speaks pockets details, and will later distill the room's ache into sentences that feel carved, not written. Nightwood is still ahead, but you can sense its sap rising, the tragic comedy of desire, the comedy of its tragedy, and a menagerie of people trying to love without a map. Barnes observes Barney as one observes a lighthouse, useful, brilliant, a little blinding if you stare too long. The younger women orbit between the two, collecting permission slips for futures they haven't named yet. Romaine leans a sketchbook against her knee and begins a quick study of a guest whose hat tries too hard. Her wrist moves like a metronome. Her gaze slices like a violin note. Few speak of it aloud, but you feel the gap between Romaine's severity and Natalie's sparkle, a two-person weather report that periodically collides. Some nights, they walk home together under a single umbrella. Other nights, their separate taxis describe a geometry you pretend not to notice. Paris tolerates arrangements with the same indulgence it gives to jazz. If the rhythm holds, the improvisation is forgiven. Across from the tea, things a countess in a dove-gray wrap reads a crisp prose fragment about an afternoon that behaves itself until it doesn't. A small cheer rises from the back row, where two students sit on the flagstones pretending not to be changed. Someone asks, half joking, whether a writing career can be built on garden parties. Barney answers without blinking, on gardens and on work. She has funded journals, pushed publishers, introduced writers to translators, applied pressure where institutions pretend not to hear. Is a salon frivolous? Only if you think pollination is a hobby. A woman at the edge asks the kind of practical question that keeps revolutions from floating away. Where do we send the manuscript names are given? Addresses too. A painter offers to illustrate a limited run if someone can find paper. Paper is scarce in the self-confidence department tonight. Natalie hands out both sheets and compliments as if they came from the same folio. You consider how social media now performs this function at scale links encouragement, the occasional storm. Except here, the algorithm is a person with good lighting and impeccable memory. There are murmurs about Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness across the channel. Band denounce selling faster with every denunciation. The Garden treats the outrage not as gossip, but as logistics. Who will host the reading? Who will write the rebuttal? Who will carry copies in luggage to avoid customs officiousness? In Paris, censorship often arrives late to the party, looking for a scandal that has already changed clothes and left by the side gate. You sense how the salon scandals differ from Montparnasse's earlier theatrics. Here the affairs matter, but the ideas matter more. Lovers arrive and depart like weather fronts. The sentences remain, and they carry names that used to be whispers. You recall Picasso's studio, where color performed confession. Here confession performs as craft. If Colette turned her life into chapters, and Josephine turned applause into armor, Natalie turns a garden into infrastructure. A moth circles the lantern. Chairs scrape lightly. Somewhere in the street, a taxi coughs, reminding the poems that the city still runs on meters and rent. One last reading begins, vowels soft as fresh bread, and just as dangerous, and you jot a mental note about how revolutions sometimes feel like someone offering you a better adjective. The night slides forward while a breeze ruffles the leaves, and you can't tell whether it is the garden or you that has learned to listen differently. You duck off the boulevard into a staircase that seems to have been built by someone who disliked right angles, and at the top, you find an office that smells like damp paper and strong tea. The sign on the door is Modest Transatlantic Review, but the talk inside is not. Ford Maddox Ford sits behind a desk that looks undersized for his reputation pages fanned out like a magician's deck. He is part editor, part impresario, part weather system, and today the barometer reads complicated. In the corner, a woman listens with the stillness of someone who has learned that movement can be mistaken for agreement. Jean Reese, Dominica-born, watchful, newly published, already decoding the room. You feel the air tighten, not from smoke, but from possibility. Ford reads aloud in a rumbling baritone, savoring commas as if he'd invented them. He praises the cool blade of Reese's sentences, their way of finding the soft spot in a moment, and pressing gently and then not gently at all. He says she cuts to the nerve, which is both compliment and warning. Editors in the 20s love a find. They also love to claim the finding. You've seen this dance before mentor, as midwife mentor, as map mentor, as mirror he hopes you'll step into. It's generous, and it is not innocent. The room is a tight amphitheater of glances. A battered typewriter waits like a brass animal. Proofs whisper on the table. There is a portrait on the wall by Stella Bowen, Australian painter Ford's partner, whose brush catches his broad forehead and the stubborn set of his mouth with unsparing affection. Bowen's presence is quiet, but not minor. She and Ford share work dinners, baby schedules, the improvisations of an unmarried household that Paris pretends are tidy. You feel her in the room, even when she's not in the room. A second editor with a painter's eye for proportion. Reese reads, now voice-low vowels carrying a Caribbean undertow. The story drifts past a cheap hotel. A woman counting coins, a quarrel that folds in on itself like wet paper. Nothing dramatic happens, and somehow everything does. Ford leans forward pleased. He will write an introduction for her collection, he says, to tell people what kind of clean danger they are about to meet. An introduction is an anointing and a tether. Does it help or does it tie? Depends who's holding the rope. The afternoons stack up. Critique becomes conversation. Conversation becomes ritual. Ritual becomes the thing people notice when you arrive together at the same cafe. Paris shuffles its gossip deck editor and protege, older and younger fame and hunger. The triangle firm's Ford Bowen Reese in the office has trouble staying just an office. The piles of manuscripts start to look like barricades. The teacups look like positions taken. You stand by the window and watch the Seine carry an armada of reflections while the three of them try to arrange a private treaty that will not hold. Stella Bowen continues painting in a separate studio, but her studio knows the plot. She has a talent for restraint on canvas and in conversation. Silence for her is focus, not surrender. She loves form, and she loves the man whose form won't sit still. When she sketches Ford at his desk, the lines are thick, affectionate, decisive. When she later writes about this period, the sentences will be cooler than the memory, as if the only way to draw heat is to leave white space around it. You learn again that some people defend themselves with language and others with pauses. Reese keeps writing. The Transatlantic Review runs her work. Ford's introduction crowns the left bank. And then comes the novel that thinly veils what no veil can hide, Quartet, called Postures. In one edition, turns the editorial office into fiction, the fiction into mirror, the mirror into a lamp left on, in a room you would rather keep dim. Readers pretend not to recognize anyone and immediately recognize everyone. The woman in the book endures patronage that is help and not help, shelter and trap. She navigates a city that smiles and eats. It is not a revenge story. It is more interesting than that a weather report from inside the storm printed while the storm still reigns. Ford bristles. Editors love candor until candor names the furniture. But he is not a cartoon villain. He promotes work he admires. He injures feelings he doesn't mean to. He believes in literature the way other men believe in maps. He has edited the English Review, published voices that changed the century, and now he believes he has spotted another one. The trouble is that influence and infatuation share a hallway, and the doors between them are badly labeled. How do you keep power from borrowing the tone of affection? How do you keep affection from rewriting the minutes of a meeting? Bowen paints portraits that refuse melodrama. Reese writes scenes that refuse comfort. Between them stands Ford, expansive, contradictory, genuinely helpful, deeply hazardous. The triangle has none of Picasso's colors and all of his angles, except here the medium is sentence and silence rather than oil and charcoal. Remember Barney's Garden, where rules of argument protected the work. This office tries to be a garden, fails, and becomes a case study instead. If you've ever watched a workplace Slack thread take on the humidity of a relationship, you already know the texture every edit is suddenly a subtext. Every compliment arrives with receipt. You glance at the ledger of consequences. For Reese publication, then the particular fatigue of being understood too well by strangers. For Bowen, a memoir's worth of composure gathered from nights when composure had to be built plank by plank. For Ford, the recognition that introducing a voice means letting it speak even when it speaks about you. Literature, it turns out, is not a loyalty program. The bill arrives in reviews, in whispers, in the long tail of a reputation. A small practical scene interrupts the analysis, because that is how life interrupts itself. A messenger appears with proofs. A meeting is set with a printer. Someone remembers there isn't enough money to pay everyone at once. Ford juggles. Reese folds a page and asks if a paragraph can breathe more. Bowen chooses a color for a jacket design that makes the title look steady. If scandal is the storm cloud, the work is the rain you can actually touch. Would you keep reading these people if they'd been perfectly well behaved? Maybe. Would the sentences be this sharp if they hadn't pressed against sharpeners, you can ask? Paris will shrug. When you step back into the corridor, you notice how narrow it is, how easily elbows meet walls. That seems right. The office was never roomy enough for 3 people and an era. Years from now, readers will connect dots that felt like bruises at the time, praising Reese's clean bravery, revisiting Bowen with fresh respect, ranking Ford's virtues and failures on scales that did not exist when the tea steamed on those winter afternoons. But the cramped room gives you the only chronology that matters: page then life, life then page. The city can host an opera of affairs downstairs. Upstairs, a paragraph finds its final cadence, and that too is scandal of a kind. The stair treads complain as you descend. Outside, the boulevard is dressed for evening again, taxis nosing forward a perfume you can't name turning in the air. You pass a shop window full of gloves, and for a second you see manuscript pages instead, pairs meant to fit fingers, misaligned seams that hold until they don't. A printer's bell rings in the distance, brisk and unromantic, as if to say that paper affairs must meet ink on deadline, no matter who sat where at the table. Imagine ambition, walking hand in hand with aristocracy down a mirrored staircase, pausing only long enough to adjust a string of pearls and sign a contract that will outlive every romance in the room. You're at 31 Rue Cambon, where the carpet hushes your steps and the staircase repeats you into infinity. And you can feel it. Love here doesn't arrive with roses. It arrives with titles, estates, and a pen. You catch Coco Chanel in her command center part atelier, part stage, part chessboard. The 1920s have turned her into a phenomenon jersey liberated from the gym, the little black dress crowned by Vogue in 1926, simplicity sharpened into power. She has learned what we've been seeing all decade in Paris. Affection is lovely, but alignment is leverage. So when Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich, exiled Romanov handsome as a coin, newly minted appears in her orbit around 1921, you can practically hear the city lean closer. Dmitri carries the chill of Russia and the heat of scandal. Yes, the Rasputin plot sits in the footnotes, but he also carries introductions. One of those leads to perfumer Ernest Beau, and suddenly the air at Rue Cambon smells like number 5. Would you call that destiny or networking with Better Cologne number 5 launches in 1921? With a bottle as stark as a laboratory vial, a kind of anti-boudoir move that feels dangerously modern. The scent is a chord, not a solo aldehydes and florals stacked the way Josephine stacked spotlights. Chanel understands that a perfume isn't a dress you can wear. Paris understands that a rumor can be bottled. Dmitri fades from her life, but the introduction doesn't. That's a pattern the decade has taught you. Some affairs become legends. Others become infrastructure. Which would you prefer, written into your biography? By 1924, the romance of molecules requires the prose of money. Parfums. Chanel is created. Pierre Wertheimer takes the lion's share, about 70%. Théophile Bader of galleries. Lafayette steps in for a slice, and Chanel astonishingly light at only 10% trades equity for global reach. You might want to shout, "Read the contract, Coco," from the balcony, but she's playing a longer game, confident that the brand named after her will answer to her. It's a Montparnasse lesson, translated into business. If gossip is currency ownership, is interest compounded? Do you side with the artist who keeps control, or the operator who scales? The decade shrugs and orders both. Then comes the Duke. Hugh Grosvenor, 2nd Duke of Westminster Bendor, to his friends arrives with Scotland in his pockets and a yacht on his calendar. Chanel's world acquires heather grouse and a color vocabulary that will one day soften into tweeds. Their relationship stretches from the mid-20s into the next decade, an alliance made of charm and argument, invitations and refusals. He offers titles, adjacent comfort. She offers a mind that refuses to curtsy. When he sends her ropes of pearls, she piles them, as if to say, "Thanks, I'll style the monarchy my way." Ever dated someone whose surname felt like a weather report? Chanel checks the forecast and brings her own umbrella. Evenings with Westminster aren't only picnics and rivers. They're negotiations about independence. He expects a certain geometry of deference. She redraws the room. Friends recall ferocious debates, laughter that snaps back like a tape measure and a mutual appreciation fused with immovable wills. You recognize the Hemingway pattern, two versions of a future arguing over the same dinner, but here the third character is a company. Chanel will not let a romance write her schedule in ink. When Westminster gently suggests domesticity, she replies with couture a week. Meanwhile, the work keeps multiplying. Ateliers hum upstairs. Le Train Bleu hits the Ballet Russe in 1924, with costumes that look like seaside sport engraved onto bodies. The mirrored staircase hosts private shows where models descend like punctuation marks. Clients arrive in waves, society, women shedding ornament, young women claiming it never belonged to them. If Barney's garden turned conversation into infrastructure, Chanel's staircase turns fittings into policy. You can almost hear the city's older rules scuff their shoes in the foyer before being sent home. Rumors braid through the success. Was there a glancing romance with Stravinsky when she sheltered his family earlier in the decade at Bel Respiro? A friendship elevated by patronage. Paris files it under usefully ambiguous, the same drawer, where it keeps half the artist's alibis and all the collector's promises. The point isn't tallying hearts. It's tracing how each attachment tilts the compass. Dimitri roots her to Beau. Westminster roots her to influence networks that make expansions feel inevitable. Affairs in this city are not always sanctuaries. Often they're bridges. Do you cross if you know the toll will come due later? Contracts, however, do not swoon. The 1924 perfume deal will haunt her pride, and the pride will haunt the deal. She wants more control. The Wertheimers want more distribution. Lawyers want more paper. If the Fitzgeralds showed you love as a carousel Chanel, and her partners show you business as a seesaw where nobody sits still, the lesson lands quietly. Genius can sketch a dress before breakfast. A signature can outrun it by lunch. You pause at the staircase again, watching buyers, baronesses, and new money Americans come and go like tides. Chanel times her entrances with the same accuracy she expects from Hems. She's polite to dukes, but obedient only to ideas. She's grateful for introductions, but loyal to the mirror. Remember Picasso's studio with its two weathers. Rue Cambon has two weathers as well: affection and autonomy. The doorstaff can read both conditions in the first 10 seconds of a caller's smile. Are you happy? Someone asks her at dinner, the kind of question that sounds caring and arrives with a ledger. Chanel answers in various ways depending on the night, but her actions keep returning to the atelier's clock. She finances edits cuts. She learns that the most scandalous romance in Paris might be a woman's ongoing commitment to her own authority. Does that make her cold, or simply modern enough to admit that power and tenderness require different wardrobes? Across the river, Josephine closes a show to thunder. Up the hill, Colette drafts dialogue with claws. Down a side street, Reese sharpens a paragraph that will outlast a season. The city hums with their frequencies, while Chanel rearranges the silhouette of a century. If earlier scandals taught you how desire can scorch the couture corridors, teach you how desire can scaffold love as resource alliances, as scaffolding poles. The finished shape, elegant enough to hide the steel. Tilt your head on the mirrored stair, and you see it, not the faces, but the angles they enabled. A courier hurries in with swatches. A duchess hovers over buttons, as if choosing a future. Outside, a taxi idles the drive.